Hello Year 5, this is Miss Hall. This is your SPAG video for the week, which will be about relative clauses. Before we get started on relative clauses, have a look at the following sentences. Can you correct any errors? Pause the video to do them by yourself first, and then once you've done so, unpause and we'll go through them together. Okay, so hopefully you've had a go by yourselves. Now let's have a look at these sentences. So the first one, brilliant. It's got a capital letter for the start of a sentence and for Mr. Mr. Rollins. Now Mr. Rollins is a name, so it's a proper noun, so it needs a capital R. Mr. Rollins' cat. The cat belongs to Mr. Rollins, so we need to use an apostrophe for possession. Mr. Rollins' cat, who is called Misty. So this is an embedded relative clause, and we're going to be speaking about these in a moment. We need to separate the embedded relative clause with commas either side of it. We can also see that Misty is the name of the cat, and therefore being a name is a proper noun, and we need to give it a capital letter. Mr. Rollins' cat, who is called Misty, wake him up. That doesn't sound right. Wake him up early this morning. We need to change this to past tense, so we need to change that to an O to say woke. Mr. Rollins' cat, who is called Misty, woke him up early this morning for her breakfast. Second sentence, there you go, said Miss Hall. There you go. This is the wrong type of there, so we need to change it to this type of there. There you go, said Miss Hall. So the verb said tells me this is direct speech, so I need to use some inverted commas. There you go. We need to put the punctuation inside the inverted commas. Said Miss Hall. Miss Hall is a name, so we need capital letters to show that. There you go, said Miss Hall, as she placed the plate of cakes down. Full stop, inverted commas. Enjoy. Okay, and third sentence, deep in their den. Now this den, it's the fox's den, so it belongs to them. So we need to change this there to show that the den is theirs. Deep in their den, comma, and then we need to change this to a lowercase t. Deep in their den, the foxes. Now we spoke about this a couple of weeks ago or last week. We need to change this. Fox, when fox becomes plural, when there's more than one, because it ends with an X, we need to put the ES. So deep in their den, the foxes gathered together to keep warm. So hopefully you did well with that. Okay, so let's talk about relative clauses then. So relative clause adds additional information about a noun. It's a type of subordinate clause, so we're adding it to our sentences to give more information. The word relative, if you look at the root word relate, it links to something. So the relative clause will always link to the noun. A relative clause also uses a relative pronoun. So relative pronouns are most commonly the WH words, but we also have that. So that, which, who, where, whose, and when. So let's have a look at these sentences that contain relative clauses. Mowgli lives deep in the jungle where he is surrounded by wild animals. So where is my relative pronoun. Mowgli lives deep in the jungle. This makes sense on its own. This is an independent clause. We don't actually need any additional information for this to make sense. We add the relative clause. It's a non-essential relative clause. So this sentence is not relying on the relative clause. So where is the relative pronoun? Where he is surrounded by wild animals is the relative clause. This has been added, but it's non-essential because Mowgli lives deep in the jungle actually makes sense on its own. When we add non-essential relative clauses, we separate it using a comma. If we look at the second one, this is the jungle where Mowgli lives. So we can see again, where is our relative pronoun. Where Mowgli lives is our relative clause, but you can see there's no comma. Does anybody know why there's no comma? We spoke about this being non-essential. This part of the sentence here makes sense without the relative clause. Now let's read the part without the relative clause here and see if it makes sense. This is the jungle. That doesn't make sense on its own. So actually, this relative clause is essential in making this sentence make sense. When we include essential relative clauses, we don't need to put a comma. This is the jungle where Mowgli lives. Now let's look at the third type of relative clause. Mowgli, who lives deep in the jungle, was raised by wild wolves. Now, who is our relative pronoun? Who lives deep in the jungle is our relative clause. Now, the difference with this one is this is an embedded relative clause, okay? So it's within the sentence. And similar to parenthesis, we need to separate this and show this embedded clause using commas, okay? Now, of course, where relates to the jungle, as it does in this sentence, and who relates to Mowgli. Okay, so your turn. Can you spot the relative pronoun? So we've got a range of sentences here. Can you first of all spot the relative pronoun? So, Winston Churchill is the man that led his country to victory during World War II. The relative pronoun is, of course, that. Now, again, this, Winston Churchill is the man, does not make sense on its own. So that led his country to victory during World War II is an essential relative clause. We need that to make this sentence make sense. And in that case, we do not need to put a comma there. Sentence 2. Shere Khan the tiger, who was fierce and evil, was feared by all in the jungle. So let's have a look. Who is the relative pronoun? Who was fierce and evil is our relative clause. And as we can see, this is an embedded relative clause. So we do need to separate it using the commas. And the last sentence, Miss Hall has been training Ruby, who is a very cheeky puppy. Now, Miss Hall has been training Ruby. That's a standalone sentence. It makes enough sense on its own, but we're choosing to add a little bit more information about Ruby. However, that information is non-essential, which means we don't need it for this first part of our sentence to make sense. Therefore, with the non-essential relative clauses, we must put a comma after the main independent clause. Miss Hall has been training Ruby, comma, who is a very cheeky puppy. So let's just recap. We've got that is our relative pronoun, we've got who, and we've got who. That led his country to victory during World War II is our relative clause. Who was fierce and evil is our embedded relative clause. And who is a very cheeky puppy is our relative clause. Okay? Now, I want you to remember what I've told you already and see if you can check the punctuation of the following relative clause sentences. So remember what I told you. Embedded clauses, we need commas either side of the embedded clause. With essential relative clauses, we don't need a comma. With non-essential relative clauses, we do need a comma to separate them. Okay, so have a little look, pause the video, and then we'll go through them together. Okay, the children who were missing each other couldn't wait to get back to school. So the children who were missing each other couldn't wait to get back to school. What we've got here is who is our relative pronoun, who were missing each other is our relative clause. We can see it's embedded, therefore we need to separate it using commas. The children who were missing each other couldn't wait to get back to school. Number 2, I have just finished reading this book, which I would really recommend. Now, I have just finished reading this book, which is our relative pronoun, which I would really recommend is our relative clause. This is non-essential. The first part of the sentence makes sense on its own. I've just finished reading this book, which I would really recommend. Okay, so we need to separate because this clause, relative clause, is non-essential. we need to separate it with a comma, okay? Because this part of the sentence makes sense on its own, we then separate it from the relative clause. Now, the last sentence, I like the photo that I took of me and my best friend. That is our relative pronoun. That I took of me and my best friend is our relative clause. I like the photo doesn't make sense on its own. Therefore, that I took of me and my best friend, this relative clause is essential, okay? We need it for it to make sense, so we don't put a comma. I like the photo that I took of me and my best friend. Okay. Now, I would like you to complete the sentence with the correct pronoun. So you've got a range of sentences. I want you to think about what pronoun you might need to make these sentences make sense. So pause the video, have a go, and we'll go through it together. So number 1, it reminded him of the house blank he used to live in. What do we think might work here? It reminded him of the house that he used to live in. We could put where. It reminded him of the house where he used to live, but then we'd have to get rid of in, otherwise it wouldn't make sense. Okay, so either it reminded him of the house where he used to live, or it reminded him of the house that he used to live in. The girl, blank, loves sport, joined her local football team. So this relative clause will be relating to the girl. So we need to put who. The girl who loves sport joined her local football team. And you can see we've got it punctuated. This is an embedded relative clause. This was essential, okay? It reminded him of the house. We needed this part of the sentence for the whole sentence to make sense. Let's look at number 3. I like to go to the beach, blank, it is sunny. Okay. I like to go to the beach when it is sunny. I like to go to the beach makes sense on its own. This is additional information, therefore it's non-essential. We need to put our comma. A tiger's fur is covered in stripes, blank, it uses for camouflage. Did we manage to get it? It is which. A tiger's fur is covered in stripes, which it uses for camouflage. Now, again, a tiger's fur is covered in stripes. This is a standalone sentence. It makes sense on its own. Therefore, this relative clause is non-essential. We don't need it, but it adds extra information. When it's non-essential, we separate it with a comma. And then the last one, that's the shop, blank, I bought my new bike. The relative pronoun we're looking for is where. That's the shop where I bought my new bike. This is our relative clause. Now let's have a look at the first part of the sentence. Would it make sense on its own? That's the shop. That's the shop doesn't make sense on its own. Therefore, we need this relative clause for it to make sense. That's the shop where I bought my new bike. Therefore, it's essential. And with essential relative clauses, we do not put a comma. So hopefully that has helped you. Just a quick recap. Relative clauses must include a relative pronoun, where, who, when, that, whose, or which. A relative clause adds information about a noun. The different types of relative clauses are essential, where we need the relative clause for the whole sentence to make sense. Non-essential, where the first part of the sentence makes sense anyway, but we're just adding additional information. And we have embedded, where it's in the middle of the sentence. So every Wednesday, I watch The Great British Sewing Bee, which is my favourite TV show. Is this essential, non-essential, or embedded? Every Wednesday, I watch The Great British Sewing Bee. That makes sense on its own. So which is my favourite TV show is a non-essential relative clause. We separate it with a comma. Second one, that's the boy that won the race. That won the race is the relative clause. That's the boy doesn't make sense on its own. Therefore, this relative clause is essential, and therefore we don't need the comma because we're relying on it. We need to include it for this whole sentence to make sense. And then the last one, Frinton, which is a small coastal town, is a lovely place to visit in the summer. which is a small coastal town, is our embedded clause. It's extra information. We need to separate it with our commas. Hopefully that helps, and good luck.